All right. Hello, everyone, and hello, YouTube and developers. This kind of mini stream slash video I'm doing to essentially try to provide some feedback for the devs. This game is in early access for those of you who don't know yet or who are watching this, and um, but yeah, I haven't given a tremendous amount of feedback because I feel like this game is sufficiently complicated enough that just a few drops don't, like, just a few comments don't really suffice. So, um, I've decided to uh, do a video essay or perhaps a series of video essays to try to just basically explain my thoughts on the game, um, what's good, what's bad, and just give feedback onto how, if they're looking for advice or changes, how I might go about working on the game. Um, I'm preface this saying I'm not a game developer. I don't expect any of these suggestions to. I have no expectations that these suggestions or thoughts are heeded or not. But I figured it'd be useful, um, and since I am one of the few people, if one of the only people streaming this game right now, I figured it'd be good to know. I don't know, my take on especially the high levels of the game. Um, so there's a lot of ways to go about this. You could, uh, I I've considered going it from like the tactical level to the strategic layer, or vice versa. You can go through the card list, but I think the best way to approach this series of essays is simply to work through basically step by step what goes through an adventure, what's going through my head in adventure, and things I'm thinking about, right from the title screen to say like the final boss in Dragon. So today I'm mostly gonna focus on covering um, big general strategic ideas about the game that come about as we go straight from the beginning into the run. Um, and what I'm generally thinking about, what I'm happy to think about, what I'm think is interesting, and then kind of some of the not so great things. So we're going to talk a bit about heroes and hero balance and what they lie in, the structure of the quests and why I choose to play Water Gem, and what I think about the game modes, and um, kind of basically the very start of the game. Um, so I think the best thing to know is, like, okay, I mostly entirely run Water Gem. Um, there's there's a few reasons why I run exclusively Water Gem. For start, I think it's a lot of the game modes. It's not that they aren't interesting. I actually really like the idea of custom quest, like doing a 3 or 4 stage custom quest, just random base seed. I think is really interesting. But both combat run and custom quests, and I haven't done much on Endless Odyssey, are really not balanced at all at this stage. Both combat one and custom quest, the first boss you face is the Spike back, and basically you can't beat that on high difficulties um, as the first major objective. You could probably do it if it was the second. If you like faced an elite first and then faced um, as the first boss and then faced the combat run and custom quests thereafter. Um, oh, I turned off my webcam. I just realized. I can turn that back on real quick, so you can see me. All right, there you go. Um, yeah. Um, but pretty much like the baseline enemies are just too easy. If you play this, in my opinion, if you play it on hard, and where you can actually beat the spike back um, at in a reasonable frame, and then it's just impossible to do it at the higher difficulties. So so I don't really touch a lot of these custom game modes because of that, um, just because they're not tuned yet. Um, in terms of why I play Water Gem over God Hunter, there's there's two. So this is a roguelike game, pretty much. I don't think there's any secret that the devs are intending this to be a roguelike game where you um, play through like one iteration, some pseudo randomly generated, and a big part to me of roguelike games and the especially at hard difficulties is the fact that they are based around finite balancing. And when I say finite, there's two kind of I'll shift OBS over here. There's two kind of uh, come on. There's two types of ways to think about games. Think about games like this. You have kind of you have finite games, and then kind of infinite, or you can think of it as short-term, long-term. And I think it's easier to describe infinite first. So in an infinite idea, the characters, you are thinking about the characters in the game purely from a statistics standpoint, and what matters is from a statistics standpoint. So, what matters for what this means is that the game is relentless about um, characters having the same block per turn, um, characters having the same damage per turn, characters having basically it's per turn analysis, and the ability to say beat a boss or beat a given opponent is not so much is based entirely around whether in the standard line of things you can keep up with it essentially indefinitely. A good measure of this is the fact that if it doesn't matter if your boss's HP has 100 or 500 health or 10,000. It just is a matter of time. That means you're playing a infinite-based game or a long-term game. Basically, this is all about setting up a combo. Actually, I'm just going to type this in Word. So you have finite versus infinite. And so finite is per turn, is per turn based. You're focused on setting up a combo. Max HP on things doesn't really matter. And so the idea is that like you're trying to set up abilities and set up combos where you can essentially lock into a rhythm and just ride out that rhythm. So basically, you reach the goal. The goal in each fight is to reach a state where you can't lose and then ride it out. And so yeah, the balance around characters becomes like their damage per turn or their block per turn, and whether they can get into combos. This is opposed to a finite view of games in which the goal is you're thinking more along the lines of you have a finite amount of resources going into a fight and you're trying to um, finite amount of resources going to a fight, and you are essentially trying to um, win before you lose, or um, um, so what this often means is that stuff like burst is important. Burst is important. Um, um, killing the enemy. Um, the enemy will eventually kill you. Um, 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 getting single single powerful turns are relevant. Um, in the large scheme of things, if you're talking about like on the strategic layer where you're managing the map, this means that you will run out of food and you have to beat the game by a certain point. Um, whereas the infinite would say um, you've you develop an entirely self-sustaining team that can explore the map infinitely. Um, and this game, I feel like the devs' intention for this game is to make it a finite game, right? The heroic update shows that in spades, right? You can't use the the heroic cards more than once. They're meant for you to use them at a very specific turn to push the threshold or get things working a certain way. Um, the food mechanic and the fact that it doesn't replenish very much attests to the fact that you have to move forward. Um, there's only a finite amount of stuff you can do, and it's typically how roguelikes are made and balanced. You're another big thing about finite games is that you are trying to spend your resources to get a just enough to beat the enemy. And my problem with God Hunter is that you only ever really actually win God Hunter if you get something, if you get one of these major power combos that basically run flawlessly. Um, the bosses have so much HP. The runs are so long. Um, the in terms of like distance travel, I don't mean in terms of timeline. Distance traveled, uh, relative to the power curve, that you can't you can't really you encounter so many different things that if your team comp isn't able to beat anything and beat anything consistently, and not lose any HP. Um, and it's basically if your comp doesn't become a perfect running machine that's comboing, you don't win the run. You just lose it, because you just run out of stuff. Um, you run out of HP. You get to one of the bosses and you just like don't deal enough damage before all your powers are stripped. Um, Water Gem I find is short enough and has bosses that um, are just at the point before jumping into Infinite that you can actually play around with just barely getting through. Right? There's fights where I kill the Necromancer, but if the game had gone on one more turn, I would have died. And the same really goes for the dragon. The dragon is very much a race against the clock to beat him down. Uh, and that also kind of goes. There's some wonky scaling in this game, but the um, the water gem you can actually do stuff like completely ignore the third act. Like I take typically 0 to 1 fights after I kill the necromancer and before I kill the dragon. In that time slot, I basically am just shop jumping because the fights are so treacherous. And there's a problem in that, I think. But the fact is that like I can actually do that. Whereas on God Hunter, like if I need to dodge fights, there's just not enough resources. And and that's one of the reasons why like I can actually play Cataclysm 8 and have a chance of winning. And I think that you probably can't get past Cataclysm. You definitely can't get past Cataclysm 6, in my opinion, on God Hunter, and it's going to be very hard to get past Cataclysm 5. I'm actually curious if anyone's beaten it yet. If we go to Rivals, we have we have some Cataclysm 5 wins. All right, yeah. Yeah, there's been a lot of people trying to crack this, so I'm not surprised. But I highly doubt anyone's going to get past Cataclysm 6 on God Hunter. Just because it just doesn't... The just massive HP pool and enemy pool that gets accumulated in these runs tend to just overwhelm them. And I think that's a little sad. Personally, I like a lot of the reason this game's actually quite good in that making. I say about like 50 to 60% of the cards are viable in situational situations. Is that redundant? That's probably redundant. But where you see a lot of the breakdown in cards and where cards are just absolutely useless is the fact that they are designed for finite situations, and the game just reaches this long-term basis where they're just not good. And this happens a lot with like the warrior cards and warrior items. Like all the melee legendaries are pretty much garbage. Unless you get the Blade of Misfortune and the Water Gem legendary and you stick them together to draw through your deck without any penalty, like you're not... There's just very few things you can actually do with the melee legendaries. It always feels really bad to roll them right now, just because the warrior simply can't compete with a lot of the bosses in terms of the damage necessary. It's not good enough to have like a really stacked warrior that can burst 30 damage in a turn and then be pretty much done, right? Because when the bosses are sitting there at 6, like when the Necromancer is sitting at 40 plus, and then the God Hunter quest, like, oh my gosh, you're talking about like the Worm has like 100 something and the Planar has like probably 100 something on Cat A. It's just too much. You can't there's no burst number you can reach where that's going to be relevant. And if you're talking about like random encounters you face, it kind of gets to a similar situation where like you could build characters that can clean through single target stuff, but at some point like the number of enemies just gets so large that you just need massive indefinite AoE clears. And so the fun I personally have and the fun that I get from this game, and I think where the roguelike excels, it's actually it's in the fact that there is a type of play that you can, I don't want to say exploit, but take advantage of, that lets you embrace the finite elements of the game. It makes me actually make use of stuff like heroics, right? Like, for instance, like the Necro fight is short enough where I can actually use, and in the past few streams I have been doing this, I can actually use stuff like the Ghost and Rose bows as my primary AoE. I can use, let me get back to the main menu. I think it's multi-shot is the card. I'll hop to our heroics real quick. I can actually use stuff like multi-shot as my, like if I have 2 multi-shots, that's actually probably all the AoE I need, which is really cool for God Hunter or for Water Gem runs. So the fact that I can beat the Necromancer with just multi-shot is great, because it means that like I can get this like 1 tech card and then that can solve a problem. But whereas like if I'm looking at God Hunter and certain elements of Water Gem, I can't do that. I'm fairly certain that the reason why the Elementalist is probably the best carry is because you have access to Overload and Eldritch Blast, which is pretty much that on top of a very select few acid builds, um, is really the only thing that can actually scale your damage in this game to the point of actually playing in the infinite. Um, like the yeah, and it yeah. So like I can't do stuff in God Hunter like play Hunter main where I stack my Hunter a ton, and I can't do stuff. Um, like I'm trying to do some alchemist stuff right now, but I can't do in both game modes. I can't do warrior main. There's just not enough consistent damage output, um, and and there's even fewer options in God Hunter. So that's why I play Water Gem mostly. It's not actually to do with the game length. It's because I feel like it's probably the most balanced for allowing you to make use of the most cards in the game and really leveraging um, uh, the fact that this is a card building roguelike. Um, you may wonder like, well, why is it being infinite bad, or why is it problematic? Some of the one of the reasons why it's a bit bad is because there's not really that many ways to reliably develop systems and combos in this game. So you only get so many crafting ingredients per run, and you only get um, you can only craft so many rares and epics typically. And one of the things is that um, this game is designed where the epic cards have rare cards, right? And I just suppose this to games like Card Hunter, which has a very similar items translate to uh, cards you draw mechanic. Um, in Card Hunter, your legendary items, the things that make the legendary items unique is they have very flat card pools. Like they'll have like six of the same card, whereas and they're all like a mediocre power card. They have different ratings in that game, and they're all like bronze tier cards. Whereas your normal cards will have like a range where you'll have like garbage tier cards, some copper, some silver, and then like a epic like gold or green tier. Um, and so your common items in that game have the super rare cards, and the things that make the legendary things interesting is that you can, if you find them, they naturally go into a specific build. And then your builder rounds, you can always just kind of pick up with your uncommons. This game has the opposite, and what that means is that you will never be able to consistently build around. Like you can never consistently build around a legendary in this game, a legendary effect. If you luck into it, you can do some stuff and you can adapt a little bit, but pretty much the kits that you're looking at are that you can always build combos with are pretty much determined immediately by your party and the uncommon item slots you can get and some of the rares. You can, I mean, you'll see me in a lot of streams. I'll craft rune stitch bracers all the time, and I can get what you get enough mithril that you can consistently make one epic, but you can't have a build where you have like where you rely on lots and lots of lots and lots of epics coming together on your characters, and you getting lots and lots of very specific power cards that you find on the epics. Like the power cards on the epics you can only really hope to build around if you roll them early, or they just happen to go into your build, or there's a lot of epic cards that do the similar thing. Like one of the big reasons why the range classes all got seriously buffed in this last patch is because multi-shot is now on both Ninja Saw's and Ghost Summer's bow, which, for those of you who don't know, those are probably two of the big items in like rapid fire. Uh, Ninja Throwing Stars is an absolutely fantastic item because it gives you uh, both, I believe. Here, I'll open the game real quick. It gives you both quick shot and yeah. So Ghost Summer's bow gives you quick shot and snapshot, which are two great things you to have in your rapid fire builds because they're super cheap attacks. And then Ninja Throwing Stars, which is often a staple. You either build Ninja Throwing Stars or Iron Throwing Knives. You get volley fire. And so the fact that both of these now have multi-shot means that you have a very good chance of getting like at least one, if not two, multi-shots on your run where you're trying to stack a bowman. Whereas before, multi-shot only occurred on one bow, and I think it was a bow that is like the long form equivalent of the purple equivalent of the longbow, if I recall correctly. And so that just meant that like you never like you only got multi-shot incidentally. Whereas now it's not good enough to be 100% reliable, but if you are high rolling a little bit, you can actually get multi-shot because it is on two big items. The same kind of goes with fireballs, right? Builds that revolve around doing 3 AoE damage. The Elementalist has Earth Grab, and you have Fireball and Flame Staff, which is a rare, which is awesome. And then you have Fireball on your Inferno Tome. And so you can actually kind of rely on getting Fireballs because they're on several items. Whereas stuff like you can never really expect to do a where's my spears? You can't reliably hope to get long spear. Like you're never really able to build for reach. Like you may like the idea of having a reach build, and I think if you had reach, it could make melee builds more powerful, but reach just isn't seen on all that much. And yeah, I very rarely get a long spear, and I'm not really planning on building one. Because it takes a lot of resources. Like you only get to build one epic. So yeah, unless I high roll specifically into a long spear, I can't ever because it's going to take multiple epics to build my characters. So that's all to say that when you're talking about these like engines, they are really extremely character specific because you can only reliably get them on specific characters, and they don't really interact. And what that means is that they don't interact with a large portion of the game, and what makes this game an interesting roguelike. Because a large part of the game is the fact that you get random items and you're trying to adapt to using them. But if I'm in a situation where I can't reliably get reach in a build, I am never going to, and I have to have an engine to win the game, I am never going to put myself in a position where reach is going to be viable. I'm going to do something where the stuff I get from uncommons and rares are going to get me that engine. And so this means that like stuff like long spears, I'll get it. It's like, oh, that would have been cool if I knew I could build around this at the beginning of the run, but it's not, because the only way this is ever viable is if I get this, or I get some of the defensive items that I need to make this viable. That's at the epic tier. So that's some of the that's why there's actually been a lot of good changes to stuff like that, but like stuff like agile builds. Um, with the exception of the alchemist, you can't really build a lot of like heavy agility builds because you just don't know if you're going to get that many. Um, you don't know if you're going to get the critical movement items to make it worthwhile because you need a lot of movement, and if you don't, you're kind of screwed. So you just go for something else, and that means because you're not collecting mobility items, you're never actually going a mobility build. Um, and uh, if you're looking to build combo. Um, now, you can choose to tech. Now, in a finite game, you can choose to tech into these because you may say, oh, I need a little bit of this, or I need this, I need mobility for a specific situation. Um, like, for instance, like there might be a few fights where having a singular fly potion is really useful, or having fly available is really useful. Um, but there's no point uh, where like having a major flight potion is going to be, or having multiple flies, or having like you're never going to make fly a part of your uh, like you're never going to make mobility a main part of your engine because there's so much stuff that has to go into it. You have to get all the mobility cards, you have to get agility, and then you have to get stuff like um, you have to get something that procs off of your mobility, and also have stuff that defends you while you're being mobile. Um, so yeah, the the fact that um, certain certain game modes require you to build very consistent engines means that you walk out going a lot of the tech cards in the game, or you walk out exploring a lot of different paths, um, because you're not thinking about the game in terms of what you are um, trying to counter. Like thinking of it as like, okay, I need specific cards to counter specific things. You're thinking about, okay, how do I make my comp work all together? And that just means that like you're doing a lot of high rolling, you're doing a lot of randomness, you're doing a lot of um, specific item hunting. You're playing the same characters every round, um, and I know I find that boring. So I tend to play Water Gem, where there is some of that. There's definitely some of that, but there's a lot less, and it's to the point where I can do stuff like play multi shots. I can do stuff like go some meme builds and try to do stuff. I almost had a run where I was able to. I had 3 Immolates. I had 2 Inferno Tomes and the Immolate Tome. I'm like, okay, I think we might actually have a chance of killing the Necromancer with this because he doesn't have that much HP. He has a lot of HP. It's so you can't do a lot of meme builds, but it's low enough where you can actually consider doing some fun stuff. And so in that regards, my probably first biggest recommendation to the devs is try like lower the defensive capabilities of the bosses, and even a lot of the standard encounters, uh, especially at high levels, because like a lot of the interesting builds and a lot of the things you can adapt into just still don't work because the things just have too much HP. Um, so like a big thing is like on the stream today, like I had an awesome, super fun high roll alchemist build where I got like tons of card draw, and he was just like this rapid fire machine, and he could do a ton of burst, and he just died to the dragon, and it was like so sad because it was like like he like I read the build, I read the stuff I needed to do. It's like, okay, I'm gonna try to see if I can get enough damage out of this alchemist to beat the dragon, and it wasn't even that close. And like I like the idea that, okay, if I'm getting these cards and I'm seeing a certain build, and I think like I don't like the world where that's always possible because then that's obviously boring. You always just force that build. But I like the idea that it's like we're like going certain you basically, to me, the ideal situation is that every build in a certain situation can win you the game. And as the difficulties go up, the number of those builds decreases. So if I were to say like have um like 20 builds, okay? At hard, say at easy, I can force all 20 builds and win in any given run. On hard, I can force 10 of the builds based on circumstances. Um, so based on how I roll, half the builds might be good, half the builds might be bad, um, and I have to figure out which 10. At highest cataclysm, only one build will win, and I have to figure out which one. All 20 are still equally viable in their own strange way, um, but because of the difficulty rise, instead of knocking out the availability of the build, it specifies which ones, right? I have to work with what I get, so to speak, and figure out how to make that work and how to make it interesting. Um, and and I differentiate this because where a game like this starts to get really frustrating is when none where you have builds that are just never viable whatsoever, or there's items that are just so bad that you can't use them, because when that happens, you're essentially rolling the dice hoping you actually get items that can go into a build that wins. And I don't know, rolling a dice when you're trying to invest very hard in playing into a game, I don't think is. I mean, some people like the high rolling nature, but I, I, I tend to try to play this game to not just high roll. I tend to try to play this game to get as far as to play the game to maximize the progress I make through the game, right? So, I'm I I'm not going to just go a 3 hero combination that will just auto win if it high rolls. I'm going to try to do ones that will consistently do well, um, because it just gets very frustrating to just keep playing high rolling. Um, so yeah, in that regard, my general recommendation is like lower the boss HP, please. Boss HP, and give them less armor. The armor thing is actually a pretty big deal. Bosses get so much armor, especially at high cataclysm when they get an extra card. Um, but yeah, the big thing that makes like Hunter go from like a fun core to build cool stuff on if you get the right cards to just not being able to win the game at all is the fact that like the dragon has too much HP, and like it's and your team just dies before you can actually do it, and so you need to bring the elementalist, because Eldritch Blast and Overload's the only thing that scales high enough to beat that HP quantity, and that's kind of the same thing on God Hunter. And so yeah, lower if you want lowering the defensive capabilities of bosses, and maybe even increasing their offensive ones. But I think in general, given how difficult this game is already, just decreasing the defensive abilities on bosses will make it so that certain builds certain builds become more viable, and then you can tune the other ones in step, right? You can, because like the reason why like people use Overload and people use Eldritch Blast is it's not because there's something necessarily strictly unfair about them. It's just that they're literally the only thing that can beat these bosses, and Like Overload is so pick and slow. Overload is so slow right now, and Eldritch Blast is also so slow. And yet people are still going to use them because they're the only things that work. And just nerfing them just nerfs the quality of life of the early game. It doesn't actually change whether or not the players are going to use them or not, or whether or not those are the only viable builds. Um, the only way to do that is to make it so that the bosses have um, uh, situations they where you can actually burst them. Um, so yeah, lower the boss HP, give them less armor. You can give them turns where they're weaker. This can get a little gimmicky, but if you have turns where like they're not going to defend, um, or like maybe they have like a really big defend card that attributes a lot of their stuff, but then you can time attacks around that. This is kind of the thing with the Necromancer. This is why I really like Water Gem, is because like the Necromancer has like draw strength, which means it has a really big defense turn, but it doesn't really have defense outside of draw strength. And like there's the Necromancer fight's a very very dynamic fight, and so is kind of the Dragon fight to that degree, because of these these factors. So yeah, lower the boss HP and um, yeah, make it so that like different offensive styles, like burst is viable, long term damage is viable. Like I think that would definitely reduce the RNG ness of this game a lot. Um, so and make the game even more fun. Um, so that's kind of what I have to say. So a little bit more about what I'm thinking about when I'm playing a Water Gem run. So there's three very concrete objectives. I currently haven't grown bored yet of just playing these three bosses and going through the same run over and over again. I could see myself doing that someday. I'd like to see someday where random custom quest is actually the main game mode that I play mostly. Modifierless custom quest, so that I can have like a random set of 3 stages where the first one's an elite and then the rest are bosses. If I knew the bosses I was facing on the run at a time, then it would be I think I'd really like that. But for now, Water Gem is fine. So the so as I said before, this game currently is very oriented towards characters being the tools that you use to beat the run. You don't really... The items you find on the run kind of dictate the form that takes, but you're never going to really, because everything is based on uncommons and the base stats of the classes, there's not really a tremendous amount of variability in, like, it's not like an item is going to come along and it's going to completely redirect the entire path of like making your warlord the carry or your witch the carry. So to that end, each character kind of you bring each character for a specific purpose. You can never be like, oh, I want to run warlord, alchemist, witch, and expect that to work, because they each need specific purposes. I don't know if that's the intent of the makers. It kind of works. The pro side is that you and this kind of goes to items too a little bit too, and we'll talk about early game items a bit. But basically, when I'm looking at this screen right here, I'm not deciding what type of run I want to do. I'm deciding how I want to try to win the game. Right? I'm actually playing the game at this screen, and um, the pro of that is it makes these choices kind of meaningful. The kind of downside is that the runs can get kind of samey because um, only certain like there's uh, um, 5 times 4 times 3 is what I'm derping now. No, 6 times 5 times 4 is 120 different combinations of uh, characters. Divide no, there's less than that because of anyhow. There's a lot of combinations of characters, but the there's actually significantly fewer because you need each character to for a specific purpose in your comp um, to deal with the various problems. Because again, characters can't get unique tools per se to deal with different situations because they are so restricted to the uncommons and the kind of effective power that those uncommons can have and the rares can have. Um, so pros and cons, you'll have to decide how you want the game to work, but for me, I just want to check something real quick. For me, that's how the game currently works. And I'm willing to play it that way, but if your goal is that like you can roll any set of heroes, or you want players to randomly roll and have like the random assortment of items and characters be kind of like that roguelike-y essence, there's going to need to be some changes to make that happen. In terms of, and specifically, the changes need to occur like on individual cards and tech cards being able to carry the weight of a roll as opposed to entire class carrying the weight of the roll. So, yeah. That said, I'm willing to spend a little time going into what each of these classes mean, how I think they're how powerful I think they are, and what I'm generally looking for. So currently in the game, I know it seems more like I'm teaching about the game than I'm giving feedback, but I just want to spill out everything I'm thinking so I can start working on what's good, what's bad, what works, what doesn't work. Like, so there's several things to consider. In every run you need the ability to efficiently deal with early fights. What this means is that early game you are extremely prone, not that you can't beat the fights, but you're extremely prone to taking massive amounts of casualties. And what you need out of your early game is you need to be able to defeat 3, 4, sometimes 5 enemies with taking little to no damage. Because you need to collect resources. And so when I'm looking at a composition, I'm asking myself, how can I do that? And there's 3 main factors that go into that. One is summons. Summons are super powerful right now in the early game because they summons are probably the only way in the game to make a zone safe. One of my problems with this game is there's very few zoning tools. There's no way for me to be able to like put up a barrier or make a zone unpassable or deny my opponents the ability to move around the space preemptively. I can I can immobilize them, and I can push them away or move them after the fact. But there's very few ways I can actually restrict where bulk enemies are allowed to go um, with preemptively, except summons. And that's because summons um, uh, path, or they have the zone of effect, and they also block line of sight. Um, so what this means is that if I have a character that has strong summons, specifically husks, um, they can carry filthy talismans, or in the case of the hunter, I can get glass lizards or bone wolves. I can actually control the space of the fight early, and that's super. Um, and so that means that the hunter and then talisman classes like the witch um, are are have a very unique item they bring to the table. And if you want to say bridge that type of thing that they bring to the table to the other classes, so that you can address this, and so that like any combination of classes can do stuff. Introducing zoning tools would be super nice. Um, like being able to build make like a cover block that's destructible, um, or like making a like frozen field somewhere that is impassable or like requires massive movement, or anything like that would um, like making it so that like you can avoid enemies swarming you and avoid archers shooting you preemptively is like such a big part of the early game. The other two ways to deal with stuff in the early game is to make your character so tanky that it doesn't matter. And so this is high early defense. Um, and this is pretty much found exclusively on the warrior. And it's specifically found there because he has access to defensive stance plus the bone sword. This gives them very efficient armor. I'm actually gonna jump in since we're talking about specific balance right now. So I'll get the top 4 characters because that's my normal configuration. So the warrior, if we go to his initial starting cards, the warrior starts with 2 defenses, which is awesome. Um, Having characters with multiple, I think he might be the only character that starts with 2 defenses. But this is a fairly huge deal. Yeah, the that you are able to, from the get-go, so you're able to just get a bit more armor there. The other fact is that you're the only character, I believe, that has... can you start with a blade on the Elementalist? I'm curious now. I've never actually tried this. Can I start with a blade on the Elementalist? I don't think I can. No, I cannot. No. Though I could switch it if I wanted to. The only classes that start with defensive stance and can have blades is the warrior. And so that just means that you get a significant amount of extra armor. On top of that, the warrior has access to all 3 of the slots that give you armor. Like not the metal shield armor, but the yellow crystal one that like gives you HP every fight. So and that allows you to take a lot of extra damage because you have access to all the defense slots at the maximum level. You also have access to 2 weapon slots and specifically 2 blade slots, which lets you even use defensive stance even better. So on top of that, you also have tons and tons of defensive powers. You have measured blow, Love the buff, and it's so much fun to. The card was already great, and now it's even more busted. And uh, stuff like intimidate. You have um, a resilience. So yeah, this class is currently the only class that can actually tank up. It's one of the reasons why I don't ever run warlords, because warlords essentially try to do similar things as warrior on the front line, but don't actually have the tank tools to do so. Um, hmm? Yeah, all the cards. Right. It's just called good luck. Yeah. So yeah, the warrior um, is pretty much the only class that has high early defense. That's why it's almost all of my every like I'll experiment between the element like these two slots, but I almost always I almost always play with uh, a warrior because of this specific reason. And so I like to see a lot more defensive options on characters. Uh, um, very few classes actually have good defense, just defensive cards in general. Like armor getting cards. Like the Elementalist has Stone Barrier, which I think is a really cool card. I used to play a lot more when I didn't have to so optimize my Elementalist. Um, Cover Shot kind of does it, not really though. Um, yeah, most classes just don't have good defensive cards, or they're very situational. Um, so yeah, defense is we'll talk about later in the runs too, but defense is super important. Um, and so yeah, so um, yeah, that's the main points of the warrior. The last thing for early fights is just kill things fast. And a high cataclysm, this you can't do this very often, but this, aka um, bone, is it the bone longbow? I forget what this. That's the crack short bow. What's I should really know the name of the item I pick on everything. This is slightly embarrassing. Yes, the bone longbow. The this thing. So the other way to deal with archers and to deal with enemies is just to kill them before they get a turn to act. Um, and so uh, this this has kind of to do with the finite versus infinite kind of thing. The fact is that the HP buffs at Cataclysm 1 means that a lot of classes just can't take out ranged things um, in the early levels. Um, and pretty much the only thing that can do it is a bone longbow, and bone longbow specifically for rattling archers, and then bone longbow +1. So in the case of the witch bone longbow plus the bolt, and in the case of the hunter, power shot plus bone longbow to take out charred archers. Um, and so yeah, so that's and the thing is that there's not really too many ways to get a cheap +1 damage or to get range damage that is significant enough to snipe things. Right? This is pretty much the only tool, especially early, to snipe. And if there is ways to like erect cover, or deal with ranged opponents or force them to come to you early. I don't know if you can get a. No, you can't get a reel in. If you get reel in as a starting item, that would be awesome. I'd love to see reel in as a starting item. I would eat like that would be so cool. Because reel in as a starting item would be like you could actually run more melee centric builds early instead of having to always have at least one person on your team with a bone longbow and headshot. yeah, I'm just gonna add that to um, uh, early the first item. Uh, I forget what the first item grappling hook I think would be super cool. Just because if you want characters to not have specified roles but specified play styles, um, giving characters um, give characters early options to deal with archers or things from afar. Um, so yeah, when I'm looking at a composition, um, yeah, these are the things I'm looking for dealing with the early fights efficiently. Um, yeah, so another thing is just more efficient mobility. Um, uh, One of the things about this game is that with the exception of some very specific synergies with the alchemist, mobility cards are pretty bad. Um, and that's to say that two like I'll get into melee and I'll get into more tactical stuff later, or maybe in a future video. I'll say that for. But I think more efficient mobility could also help. I'll get more into that when I actually dive into specific cards later. But yeah, so this is a huge factor in who I bring on my team. The next factor is uh, can all right. So fast from afar. Um, Next one is what I call single target burst, or mass single target damage. So one thing that happens is sometimes even as early as the first fights, but definitely by the time you hit the first elite in Water Gem, you start getting to the point where you need to be able to really clean through um, enemies, take out um, specific targets quickly. Before you get your AoE online, you need to be able to, like if you get swarmed by a bunch of ratlings, you need to be able to kill one off very efficiently, or you need to be able to burn through the armor of a hybrid very efficiently. And this gets back to the fact that in terms of single target damage, the only really great thing is is actually double strike. Double strike is super good at getting through stuff. That and flame fan. The reason why I see a lot of people comment and taking crackle rod. I always take flame fan because it's one of the few ways you can actually burn through enemy HP at the lower levels, and so this essentially equates to 6 damage in one card, and this is also typically 6 to 8 damage in one card with the combo strikes. So double. So yeah, this is bone sword / access to blades, and a single flame fan, typically flame fan. And this and there's other things that can contribute to this too. By the time it starts to become really relevant, right around after your first couple fights, you can sometimes start picking up other rare items that can allow other classes to start helping in this regard. Um, but it's actually pretty rare to um, get items that can like it's pretty rare to get classes that can actually efficiently clear things. Um, oh, the other thing is that cards that provide multiple attacks. Um, so I don't often get a Thorn Blade on the Witch, but that's actually a card that I consider a fair bit because it's essentially you get 2 attack cards for 1 attack efficiently. Um, Mass single target efficient damage, low willpower. Um, so yeah. So between the high defense and low and having access to single strike and that being coupled together in defensive stance, my warrior basically is the thing that carries me from Act Zero from the start of the run through the first elite. Is pretty much entirely on the warrior's back with the help of uh, headshots being specifically used against archers and um, husks for zoning tools. Um, and this makes the warrior pretty much a must-have in almost every um, build, in my opinion. It's very, very hard to play the game without warrior because there's no class that can actually get the defense up to actually tank a lot of this stuff. And on top of that, there's not many classes can actually deal with things in your face, or get in something's face and deal with it, or like skirmish the way he can. Um, and yeah, basically this means that like I'm not ever picking 3 classes. I'm picking 2 classes to go with my warrior. Because the warrior is pretty much the only thing that can survive that. Uh, because he's the only thing that actually fits a lot of this criterion. I've tried to play Alchemist as the burn through. Um, the issue is that Acid Flask just doesn't burn through well enough, and like the class just doesn't have that much. I could see a situation where sometimes the Witch, if you get a lot of Thorn Blades, but again, you just don't get that many efficient attacks, and the Elementalist just gets none. And the Warlord gets like kind of supporty things. And the Hunter, he has good long range stuff, but like there's just the classes don't have like the Warrior's just the only thing with efficient short range or efficient ways to deal with lots of HP in the early game. Um, so yeah, I pretty much always bring a warrior for that reason. And I'm surprised classes like the Witch and the Alchemist don't have really efficient single target spells. Like large like which gets kind of close with Rack. Rack is probably the closest thing to that. But the issue is Rack is very situational, and you don't often want to be waiting for your opponents to have uh, powers online. So yeah, I'd I'll know it. I'd like to see efficient damage cards like Rack, but more generally usable, show up a bit more. I think is the big takeaway there. Um, so yeah, so that's most of the early game. Going forward, AOE. Um, so able. So the next big thing is, so area effect is super important in Water Gem. Um, it is and it isn't. There's 2 big things you have to do. You have to deal at least 4 to kill. Do at least 4 AOE from flexible positions, and optimally 6 for the Necromancer fight. Um, so you don't 100% need AoE for the Necromancer fight. But the reason why you often want AoE for the Necromancer fight is A, it easily clears out the minions, but B, you can clear out the minions while also hurting the Necromancer to take off Summoner. If you have a way to remove Summoner, um, you can get away with a more single targety build, and that's a lot of reasons why I run Witch, is because I don't like to high roll as much for my AOE. Um, I'd rather uh, I'd like to just take borrow power and just zoop and take off Summoner. Um, uh, so yeah, less so if you can negate Summoner. Um, and then it is the only way of dealing with end of Act 2, all of Act 3 fights. So right now, the way things scale, I'll get it to scaling later, and I'll get into more of the nonsense of that. But in terms of just like things I'm looking for in characters, I pretty much am going to need a way to deal with the insane number of mobs of enemies that are going to be coming my way come a certain point in the run. And like when you start facing like 6+ archers or multiple elites plus some and stuff, like the fights end up getting harder than the actual bosses very early. I'm not entirely certain how things scale. Again, I'll talk about scaling at some other time, but if you're going to be planning on taking these fights, you need AoE. Personally, I end up just choosing not to take these fights a lot of times. Like I said, I skip all of the Act 3 fights almost always, just because you can still not get your AoE spells and deal with it. But if you do have AoE, it does make the fights feasible as opposed to just absolutely brutal amount of damage. You still actually take a lot of damage because you just can't kill 6 archers instantly, but you can. And so, yeah, this isn't as big as a deal if it was just the Necromancer you're talking about, but because of the way fights scale, big change. Make later game fights, or in general, make fights not just scale with more enemies, because it gets to the point where it's just ridiculous. In this game, the number of creatures you have causes your power to scale quadratically. Because I say that is that like if you have quadratic scaling, and I say that by the fact that like if you're facing 3 enemies, okay, your damage is going to be roughly constant. So you're going to have like a period of time where you have 3. So it's going to go 3, then 2, then 1. So you're going to take 3 enemies worth of damage, 2 enemies worth of damage, then 1 enemy's worth of damage. So about, if you think of these as like periods in which you can kill them, you can say 6 periods of damage. If you're facing 6 enemies, you take 6, then 5, then 4, then 3, right? So it's it ends up being it's every increment is 1 more. So it's 1/2 times x squared. It's quadratic. So this means that 6 enemies is 4 times harder than 3 enemies, and 9 enemies is 20. 9 enemies is 9 times harder than 3 enemies, etc. It's quadratic. So the fact that the number of enemies just seems to scale linearly means that the fights get like the scaling and the enemies don't scale very much at all early, and then they scale a ton late. And yeah, I'd recommend addressing that. and I'll talk more about scaling when I actually get into how I'm running the runs. But anyhow, the fact is that I need tons and tons of AOE to deal with things. Um, the next big thing is defense for powers. And this is a really big deal. So, um, if I'm building a comp, you need to defend your powers in this game. Currently, every boss in the game There's no boss in the game where you can avoid taking damage. Every boss in the game can guarantee put damage on you. Um, the both the sorcerer and the necromancer have lightning bolt, which can just randomly hit you, and the dragon has fireball, and he also has the ability to purge and then fly anywhere. Um, so you can't avoid damage. Um, you have to have either defense uh, or something that makes you immune to damage to protect your powers. Um, and the problem with this is that if you're stacking a core or you're trying to um, hit these really high damage values, which we'll talk about in a second, um, you can't do that by having lots of defensive cards in your deck. Um, your main character has to be basically, because your character has to often be kiting. This is another thing. All bosses have strong melee options. So because your character has to be essentially staying at a certain distance, they pretty much always have to invest a card just into moving most turns, or they need some utility spell to negate movement. And that means if they're spending a card also defending, that means you're only casting like one damage spell a game or a turn. So you're never stacking overpower. You're never actually using your powers. You need to cheat defense in this game. You need to get it in while you're dealing damage. And there is currently only a few ways to do this. You can do this with Abjuration. And this is why I very highly value Abjuration. It's one of the most powerful powers in the game. Abjuration, you can get Protector on another character with lots of defense stacking. This is not as reliable as Abjuration, but it can tide you over if you're in certain compositions. It's good enough for the Necromancer. It's not always good enough for the Dragon. But yeah, Protector on another character. You can. The other option is, if you really high roll a Dragon Wing Racers-esque build. I did this once on a stream. If you get Elementalists with several it's the Earth defense spell where you give someone else 4 defense, and you get stuff like force fields, and you get last stands, and you get protectors, and you have some other character who's dedicated to protecting you. This is a bit tricky because it's a bit willpower intensive, and you have to have a lot of willpower cheating to pull this off, but it can be done. And so and what this means is that these last two are not super consistent. You can try to do them, and I'm trying a lot more to experiment with Protector builds. But basically, if a character does not have a Bracer slot or a Tome slot, or they're highly contested, then it's very hard to make them a carry character. Oh, the other thing is defensive stance. Defensive stance is the only way, but melee builds are really hard to pull off as damage dealing builds. Yeah, so pretty much Abjuration is like the cream of the crop here. And so you get this weird thing where I want my core to be able to use a tome or bracers, and characters that can't run into problems. And the tome is better than the bracers because it's a rare item to get abjuration on them, whereas um, it's a epic item. You can do it if you get a soul gem and then you build one and then hone it. Um, that's a lot of investment, and your hones are often super valuable. Um, but that is an option. One of the big problems though is that you can't do that until the Necromancer fight typically, unless you get the Grave Dig event and you get lucky. And I'm not relying on the low probability of me getting the Grave Dig event and then the 33% chance of me getting the legendary to um, be able to get abjuration. So this is kind of a really big limiting factor. And the problem here, I don't think is so much that that these things are broken per se. The problem is the fact that you really can't beat the bosses without keeping your powers up for the entire time. And this has to go back to the finite thing where it's like, I can't beat a bosses unless I have a combo going. Now, fortunately, in this game, like the combo doesn't have to be that big, and so the game still feels kind of finite on Water Gem, but it's still very much a problem. It's like I can, some of the heroics help me get by a bit, but it's still not to the point where it's like I am comfortable saying that like I can get like 3 or 4 critical defense cards and I feel sufficient that I'm able to beat the boss. I have to actually specifically build a defense engine to deal with the bosses. And so I think this is going to take a little more of a fundamental change to break this out, but this is a big thing that affects whether I choose to bring a character on my comp or not. And then the last thing is just scaling damage. So the question becomes, can they do scaling damage? And you need a lot of steroids to bring down the dragon, and a good number to bring down. When I say steroids, I mean like abilities that increase, like a flat increase to your damage. So currently the only character that can do this consistently is the Elementalist with Overload and Eldritch Blast. The Ranger can come very close. So close to the fact that I think there's actually sometimes you can win Cataclysm 8 runs with him. I almost did it recently. Where you abuse Rapid Fire and Eagle Eye plus another power. And then I think the Alchemist with I'm experimenting with some acid building builds, but the thing is that there's just not that many builds that can actually reach the damage numbers. Warriors can't reach the damage numbers because they can't make that many attacks in a turn, because they either have to end their turn adjacent to the enemy, and if you're ending the turn adjacent to a dragon, you're losing all of your powers because the dragon does a stupid amount of damage. If you are and if you're backing away, that means you have to take an action to move close, hit them, and then use an action to move away. And that's your 3 cards. So you only get 1 attack, and you have to develop some way to cheat extra attacks in. And the dragon has like essentially 1 reach because of his fire breath, so like you have to be able to move 2 efficiently. It just doesn't work out. And so yeah, there's only a couple classes that can fit these criterion for scaling damage. And so if I were to break these down, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think I have 5 categories. No, I need 1 more category here. I can give a little bit of a rating onto the general balance of the classes as I conceptualize them on a strategic level. We can get into the tactical stuff later, and when I say tactical, I mean like specific cards doing specific things. But if you're talking about large scale stuff, which is what this video is about, um, uh, to the right. All right, so we have early tools, early burst, AoE, um, defense ability, and scaling damage. Um, the warrior gets an A plus, an A plus, and an A plus. Um, Hunter gets. All right, we'll just do simple scales. The hunter gets an A here. He has some burst. There is some burst here, so I'll give you like a B. Um, this is an F, an F. A hunter is not super defensible. Actually, we'll do. Yeah, we'll. The hunter has some defensibility. He has runic bracers, so he gets like a B there. Scaling damage just fails outright. And then the hunter has, I'm gonna say, I don't know, C tier scaling damage. Elementalist, A on AoE, A on defensibility because you have two options for abjuration. And then your scaling damage is an A. Early bursts. This class just fails. Early tools are okay. You can actually take a flame staff, so you get a C there. And then early burst. Okay, flame staff goes under early burst. Okay. And then Warlord. The defensibility comes from the fact that you can wield Dragon Ring Bracers well. You're not really a carry. You have no way to give stuff. So this is kind of a C. Early tools, you have pretty much none. Early burst, you have pretty much none. AoE, you pretty much have none. And scaling damage, you can help with scaling damage. So here we'll revise. So we'll give that. The alchemist actually does have early tools now. The new metamorphosis is actually absurdly strong at early game, which I love. Isn't the best thing ever late, but it's like super good early. So actually, this is one of the reasons why I was considering the alchemist a bit more. Actually, that's that goes under early burst. Yeah, just revising this. Early tools. In terms of the other tools, you can bring the longbow. So that's a pretty big plus. AoE is sketchy. You do have some options. Actually, I should give the hunter an F on AoE. You can do multi-shot now, so it's better. Defensibility is really bad. You only have one tome slot, and your potions are highly contested. You don't want to invest in that. And then scaling damage is pretty bad. It's barely up there. And then the witch has artificial AoE because it can steal a power. And that also means it has great early tools because it has 2 totem slots. That's something I forgot to mention. The elementalist has a totem slot. So yeah, this is very high early tools, very good artificial AoE. Early burst is can be okay. You more like bog people down. We'll give that a C. The defensibility is You can put some utility items on this character, but not a ton. Um, we'll give a C-ish, and there's no scaling damage to speak of. So, and obviously the A's are much more important than um, anything else. So, this is kind of like if I were to rate the classes on scales, this is what I'd be looking at. Um, so the warrior is like hands down, like he fills um, three of the four categories beautifully, um, and so much so that like the biggest thing you're looking at is, do you have the AOE or artificial AOE, and the scaling damage necessary to beat the bosses is really what you're asking. You bring the warrior, and then you get enough early tools to help out in these other categories, and then beat the bosses. And so it's typically a warrior plus elementalist. If you look here, is what you're typically going, um, and then uh, yeah, and then um, and then you could throw in something else to make the run go smoothly, and that's kind of how a lot of the runs feel right now. Um, that's not to say there isn't variety. Obviously, a lot of the classes can do a couple of the things here, but it's worth noting that like you you need you need to be like an A or B to actually fulfill the roles. Um, and so the warlord is basically just, I never use the warlord. I know there's some god hunter teams that run the warlord because it helps the engine run, but it's basically, in terms of the categories, doesn't do anything. Um, right? It's just a lot of nice stuff to have, but it doesn't actually concretely do anything well, or help, or ensures anyone else on your team does things well. Um, so I'll give it a B defense. Nah, it's a C. B. Yeah, C. Anyhow. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about the balance of the classes. The like if you look element wise, yeah, the elementalist and the warrior are probably the two strongest classes in the game, pretty much. Um, and the question is, what aspect of the game's hardest? If your early game is hardest, you want the hunter. Um, or if you want a secondary scaling character, you want the hunter. Um, if you um, I'm experimenting with the alchemist. I still don't feel like the alchemist is good, um, because he's very bursty, and acid just isn't quite good enough, right? Well, I'm gonna see if I can make acid good enough, but it doesn't feel that good enough. Um, and the witch doesn't seem to get a ton of high ratings, but um, this effective AOE is actually, it stacks a lot bad. I'm actually gonna give AOE a A. We're gonna give it an A in quotes, just because of how good that anti-power tools are. Um, so also give it a little more for early burst, like the the ability to like peel armor. Like I don't know, the witch always does feel like it's doing something. I'm never like the witch is useless. Like the witch actually does stuff. So, um, yeah. So I I hesitate to say whether the classes are bad or good, or whether you should buff or nerf any particular one. I'll get into specific aspects I'd like to see when we get to more tactical stuff later. But um, I think I'm just presenting this to show that like there is a paradigm in place of how you think about runs and how you approach runs. One thing that's not showed on here is the fact that some of these builds are more resource heavy than others, you like to have a build that uses the same amount of uh, has a certain amount of mithril in it, a certain amount of steel, and a certain amount of wood. Um, Ones that are too heavy for one than the other tend to have problems. Um, and but yeah, I like especially with the defense ability, like the fact that like it makes sense that the warrior is going to help you have defense, but the fact that like the elementalist is like the best defense, like has the best ability to defend their powers in the game, and the warlord basically does nothing, is kind of counterintuitive. Um, and the fact that the witch is like kind of like the power manipulation class, but like doesn't really have anything that can do with its powers is kind of sad. The fact that the alchemist is like a major damage class, but like it doesn't really it doesn't really should be a B. It doesn't really have any scaling damage, and its AoE is it's like I don't know. It's there's some idiosyncrasies here, based on like how specific mechanics work and what you're looking for in specific mechanics, and um, so yeah, if your goal is to try to balance the classes, devs, like I definitely would, yeah, yeah. You can either think of giving new tools to different classes, or you can think about changing this paradigm in general. And like one way you can change like the defensibility paradigm is like making it so that you don't need powers to beat bosses, um, or making it so that you don't need scaling damage to beat bosses, or um, that there's ways you can carve through enemies or create defenses that are effective against large clumps of enemies so that you don't need AoE. Like instead of having that, these are kind of like the only ways you can deal with certain problems in the game. Have multiple ways of dealing with it, and to be fair, there are different ways to do it, right? Right, like the ability to deal with early fights, right? These are three distinctly different categories, right? So like early fights feel pretty good, but like when like my defense is based entirely around me high rolling specific defensive items, um, or I have to have a very specific scaling pair to effectively beat bosses, is where the game starts to feel a little high rolling, a little jank, and it's where like a lot of the intuition about like elementalists are supposed to be squishy and warriors are supposed to be tanky and alchemists are supposed to burn everything to the ground kind of starts to fall apart. Um, and especially if you want to get to the point where it's like there's a lot of replayability, and the fact that you can play any combination of things and take any combination of starting items. There's basically only certain starting items you can take. You can only really take the bow and longbow for a ranged class. The shaman rod's pretty much the best weapon you can take there. The melee weapons have some variability. Double strike, I think, is just so much stronger that you always take it, but there's some argument for bone claymore and bone axe. The melee weapons is kind of the only thing that's interesting right now. But yeah, if you want to make like other items viable, the what was I gonna say? Yeah, there you need to look at like how tools interact with those early fights. So that's what I have right now for how I think about the early game, how I am kind of thinking about the game from the title screen. Whether that matches your vision or not, Debs, is up to you. But uh, and whether you think that's healthy or not, is up to you. I think there's some ways things can be tweaked, but that's what I have so far. My next video, I will probably start going into the specific cards in each class. and specific, and start getting into whether certain things are actually overpowered or underpowered, and um, start going into stuff like that in the class, as well as starting to go into mechanics like the food mechanic and how things scale with time and all that. This is going to take multiple videos because this is a complex game and there's a lot to think about. But this is just kind of what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about the overarching quest and how my classes and my items kind of fit into that. Um, so yeah, I hope you enjoy that. I hope it's useful to some people. I will post this on YouTube immediately and post it to the devs, and hopefully we can see if this game can be interesting. If chat has any questions, I'll field questions or talk about stuff. I know I've been monologuing for like 90 minutes straight, and that's probably more than anyone wants to hear, but do I even have anyone in my chat at the moment? That's a great question. We have 3 viewers. You guys are troopers. Oh, hi. Yeah, that was a long time, but I think it was a good chunk of analysis. Well played, Shogun. Well played. All right. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions. If not, I'm going to get going. So, but I love to discuss. I love discussing games and discussing this. So, but yeah. Give it a minute. What would I like to see from the upcoming new classes? Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I feel like they're already in development. The fact that we know there's 2 means that they're probably there. I mean, everyone wants to see a rogue. I don't blame them. I have no idea how a rogue is going to work. I let's see. So in terms of specific mechanics, like I don't know. That's a great question. I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing a class that, I hate to say this, but an actual support class. I know that sounds so jaded, but it's like this, the warlord. Like when I think of a support class, I think of a class that like buffs another character in some way that means they can operate without a certain mechanic, right? So like I actually play the warrior kind of like this with like protector, where like you play warrior to give your other teammates armor so that you don't need a major armor class. So like the warlord just makes things that people do them a little bit better. He doesn't actually like there's not this thing where you're like stacking force fields and you're force fielding tons of allies. Or there's like he like so yeah, I could see like a clerical class doing something like that. Um, yeah, I don't know. I just like to see probably different. I'd like to see different types of utility that solve the problems differently. And that sounds very vague, but um, like I could see something like a trapper being interesting. That might be where they take the rogue. Um, yeah, I don't know. Like, yeah, yeah. Whenever I think of a new class, it's like I want something that tackles the problems in a novel way, tackles the fundamental problems of the game in a novel way. Um, right? Which is why I think like the Witch is not perfect, and we'll talk about how the Witch is not perfect. But like the fact that like before to take out powers you had to deal massive damage, and with the Witch you just steal the power, and that like the Necromancer fight is super fundamentally changed. Like I can go for all sorts of weird different strats because of the Witch's steal power spell. Um, it's probably the coolest spell on a specific class in the game, and I want mechanics like that where it's like I'm able to approach the game differently and have a completely different experience. Like I'm able to like build my I want to be able to build my other characters differently based on the party, based on the members they have in the party. I think that's the best way to say that, right? Like if I'm building my hunter the same way every time, regardless of who else is in my party, that kind of makes the party compositions bland, right? Yeah, yeah. It's recorded, but yeah, I'll write it down. Yeah, yeah. Classes, new classes should encourage me to play existing ones differently. All right. This is a mess. I'm gonna have to consolidate this at some point, but yeah, that's what I want. And yeah, it's why I really like running Witch. Like I don't. There's a lot of stuff about Witch I don't like, but the fact is that I can face necromancers or face these specific fights, like and I can AoE stuff that I couldn't AoE before. I can play defensive in situations where I could play offensive, where I had to play offensively before. Right, it's just right. I can try to force the opponents to have a bad turn, with barbed arrows, and give myself like that little breathing catch up room when I'm down. Like there's weird stuff you can do with Witch that just allows you to have more flexibility and lets me try stuff like going core alchemist, and lets me try stuff like going protector warrior to get my defense. And that's the kind of stuff I want to see in new classes. So yeah. So yes. Yeah, great question. Great question. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah. All right. I'll give it a minute, and if not, I'll start winding down. It's been a long day. But, all right. All right, well, thank you all for watching and sticking in there. And oh wait, we have one. So yeah, I'm definitely gonna talk about that probably next time, but it's a little difficult because a lot of that information's hidden. Um, I'd The long and the short of it is, I think it feels quite a bit random right now. Random in the sense that, not that like I don't know what's happening, but like I can't reliably know if I'm going to get lots of shops, or if I'm going to get like lots of certain types of events, or like it just feels like the way the quest is designed. You have the three bosses, which are your known, and then a whole bunch of noise in between, just tons and tons of noise. And in that noise you can like kind of roll for certain items and try roll stuff, but like you kind of get caught in the chaos a lot of times and just die randomly, and there's no way you could really play around it because you just don't know. like you can play around it in that like you can know that like furies will only pop up on like living world ruins, and so you just don't go to ruins after a certain day. um, but like the categories are so broad that you really can't deal with that. So um, yeah, I'd yeah, it also feels like you can get a lot of events at any point in the run. um, like you can get the Mithril event with the lizards, like as your first. I've gotten it as my first event before. Um, so yeah, that's definitely a topic I want to get onto, but it's right now it's a little wonky. Um, yeah, right now it's kind of like, okay, I know the entire set of everything that can happen in the Living World ruins, so I'm gonna keep rolling Living Worlds ruins until I get it. There's no like method to the madness. Um, and it's not like something like in like FTL for instance. If you go to like an NG home world, you're getting 3 shops, and if you know that you're going to like um, like the Zoltan sector, you're facing stuff with Zoltan shields, and you're getting like a certain number, like stuff about the distribution of things you're getting, and like the probability of you encountering certain things, based on where you are in the quest. Whereas with this, it feels there is definitely some high randomness there. So yeah, that's yeah. That's that's the short answer to that question, but that's a very complicated question. So I do think this is a very fun game. I would not come and critique this game for almost 2 hours if I did think it wasn't worth critiquing. Like there's actually a lot of really good stuff here. Like the the way the mechanics interact with each other is it makes a really interesting experience. There needs to be some tuning to get it right. So yeah, yeah. All right, all right. I think I'm gonna get going. I literally am starting to not be able to hear my own voice. So so thank you guys for staying in. Yeah. It's getting to the point I can't even answer questions if I wanted to. So yeah. But I will. It's great having you all, and and I hope the devs will humor me. So that is all for tonight.